Hello viewers, welcome to another episode of Liberating Minds. For today I'm your host, Maghanga from the Revolutionary Socialist League. With me is Sobukwe Shukura from the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Today we're going to talk about the African Liberation Day, which is due to be commemorated on the 25th of May this year. And Comrade Sobukwe, welcome to this episode of Liberating Minds. So perhaps you can start by telling us a bit of a background about the African Liberation Day. What is it all about? How did it start?
Well, first I want to thank you for inviting us, and certainly, to talk about this subject, liberating minds. I appreciate the work you're all doing here. On the answer the question, though, on the question of African Liberation Day, African Liberation Day, the term African Liberation Day is 60 years old this year, but we of course realize that African Liberation Day is an extension of African Freedom Day. African Freedom Day actually was coined or created in 1958 at the first Pan-African meeting of any kind on African soil, because the Pan-African meetings that had preceded couldn't be held in Africa because of colonization. So the 5th Pan-Africanist Congress and the preceding Pan-Africanist Congress had to be held outside of Africa. When Ghana got its independence in 1957, they held two very important meetings. The first meeting was a meeting of the heads of African states. There were only 8 states free in 1958, but that meeting was held on April 15th. On April 15th, they declared that they would struggle and commemorate African Freedom Day every April 15th, and to talk about how they would how the struggle had gone, how they had advanced the struggle. And later in 1958, they had the meeting of the All African People's Conference. And the All African People's Conference is significant because it was the conference which invited all the freedom fighters, all the liberation forces. When you think about people like Patrice Lumumba was there, Frantz Fanon, the head of SWAPO, so these forces were all there. So this is significant that we remember the kickoff of the first Pan-African continental-wide meetings that took place, that kind of was the birth of having organization on our soil, on African soil. Now, fast forward, we get to a point in the African Revolution and the national liberation struggles. In particular, while forces were being manipulated to try to divide the liberation struggle, because there had been a strong core, and the imperialism realized it when those meetings were held in 1958 and everybody was on the same page. So now there was these fissions starting to happen. A very strong group of people, the Casablanca group, were the more revolutionaries. You included Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Conakry, that is, because Guinea-Bissau was still under Portuguese. You had Egypt, you had Mali, and these were very strong, wanted African unity, a government for the whole continent. The fissions started when other groups started parceling out and trying to say, no, we're only going to meet we're only going to be the friends, and all of these, or we want to meet as Anglophones, or and not seeing the bigger picture. So there was an effort to keep from having further division. The Emperor Haile Selassie at the time agreed to host a meeting that we now know as the beginning of the Organization of African Unity. And it's at when the Organization of African Unity was formed in 1963 that they said, okay, we're going to have we're going to change this day about African Freedom Day. And we're going to, since it was founded on May 25th, they changed it to African Liberation Day. And that's how African Liberation Day, as we know it, was named and formed. But we have to, we know that African Liberation Day is rooted in the struggle of African people to liberate themselves, to look at the ongoing struggle against particularly colonization on the continent of Africa. We certainly don't want to even think that that from the moment that imperialism began, that there wasn't resistance. We had all kinds of resistance, just like we had resistance to our enslavement. When people are oppressed, they're going to resist. But African Liberation Day marks a particular height of our struggle and a particular advancement of our struggle, because what grew out of the OAU was the African Liberation Support Committee, in which there was resources put together to aid the liberation forces. Now, as we move forward, we can see that African Liberation Day, after we made substantial progress, and after many countries got their independence, because I told you it was 8 independent countries in 1958, but by the time that the OEE was formed in 1963, there were 30 countries who were there to advance, to commemorate that liberation, and to say, hey, we still have more countries that we have to be liberated. And it seemed, and we were going into a real strong arm phase in the Portuguese colonies and the colonies in southern Africa. So we knew that these freedom fighters were going to have to be supported in a very heavy way to end Portuguese colonialism and colonialism in Southern Africa. And of course, today we know that we only have a few places where there's actually still colonial remnants, like we know that in Swahili, which is some people call Southwest Africa, which is now colonized by Morocco, that there's still a form of colonization. Now, and this is where we kind of get into, again, the political differences that were, and the class struggle even within the Organization of African Unity. We come to see that some people felt that when we were able to put our flags down and have our own presidents, run the old European governors out and the European militaries out, that the continent was free. And some within the OAU, and then fast forwards to the African Union, started to not want to use the word African Liberation Day. So we got Africa Day and we got OAU Day. But we think that it's important that in an assessment of where we are today, that still, the majority of our resources on the continent are still, our economic system, our resources are controlled from the outside. Still, most of the mining industry in the U.S., U.S., the United States of Africa, but now in Africa, in our continent, majority of the mining industry is controlled from the outside. So much land, commercial farming of tea, of pineapples, of different fruits is controlled by corporations, again, from the outside. We receive very little compensations for our minerals. And So, and we have, right now, we have governments that are not, we don't even have really the kind of bourgeoisie that other capitalist countries have. You know, us socialists, we're for socialism, but most of Africa is calls itself following the capitalist models, because imperialism, every time they see socialism and land reclamation, meaning people trying to reclaim their land and resources, they pounce on one of these small countries, you know, whether it's Libya and recently in 2011, or whether it's you know, the overthrow of Sankara in Burkina Faso, whether it was the overthrow of Nkrumah, you know, whenever a government declares itself socialist or declares its resources in its country as theirs and try to nationalize, could you imagine Africans actually wanting to own the land and resources in Africa? It's a reason why we went to Africa, that we began the liberation struggles. We weren't just fighting because we liked the word liberation or we liked the word revolution. We were fighting for the land and resources that had been taken by colonization. And we didn't leave our people on the battlefield. We didn't shed our blood for just a flag and somebody who looked like us. We were fighting for a reclamation or a reclaiming of the land, because we can't even talk about freedom if you don't have control of your resources. Africa is the richest continent, we say it all the time, the richest continent on the face of the earth when it talks about natural resources, even air, growing land and what have you. And but our people are some of the poorest. You know, we have over 250, 280 million people who live on what we call are living in extreme poverty. And when we talk about extreme poverty, we're talking about living on less than $2 US a day, something like 200 shillings a day, and maybe in terms that people understand in Kenya. This is horrible. This is why we can't talk about African being free without sovereignty, because sovereignty means you have reign over your land, you know, your food, your and this is freedom. So when, you know, so that's I think kind of the history of why African Liberation Day, how it got started, and why it is paramount that we continue this institution. And we don't want to be confused, because some people think, oh, this all you do is come together for African Liberation Day. No. The organizations and the committee that we have here in Kenya and all over the continent and all over the world, where people are organizing African Liberation Day, they're not. It's like those who organize May 1st, the Labor Day or the Workers' Day. It's a commemoration, but that don't mean those organizations are not doing something every day. But it helps to keep the historical memory there. It's part of building an institution. Like, listen, the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, and the October Revolution. They still commemorate it every year. Everybody else who's had a revolutionary struggle institutionalized this, because these are part of memory. If we don't continue to institutionalize our memory, we lose it. So that's why we commemorate it. But these organizations are doing much more, but they understand that we must have institutional memory of our struggle. And we must respect the blood that has already been shed in our people's name. We must support that blood. We must, we don't want anybody to think that our people fought on the battlefield, died for us, and we are not going to, we're not going to not just commemorate them, but we're going to continue what they did. We're not going to say that they died in vain. We have to institutionalize it.
Very comprehensive background on what African Liberation Day is, its roots, how it began, and I'm sure our viewers have really had time to digest and to see exactly where African liberation began. And you've mentioned the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist roots of this commemoration, the fact that the organizations, the movements, the people who were deeply, deeply engaged in anti-colonial struggles are the ones who initiated this process of African liberation. But if we ask ourselves, where are we as the African people? Because we talk about liberation and how this struggle is a process. If we analyze the present state of affairs in Africa today, where are we? Why is it so necessary for generations that are continuing with the struggle in Africa today to keep up the legacy of these people who were participating in the liberation struggle of Africa, the people who initiated African Liberation Day? As we meet for this year's commemoration, what are some of these things that we shall talk about?
Yeah, I think, and I kind of maybe have started to answer this question already to a certain degree. It's people, like I said, people don't just fight for for no reason. People fight because they have material needs. And when we talk about most of the capital that is produced on the African continent is leaving the African continent. So if we take a place just like if we gave the example of somewhere like Southern Africa, still 60% of the banking industry in Southern Africa is controlled from the outside. The settler regime, the settler apartheid regime that was supposed to be overthrown, still controls 75% of the best farming land in Southern Africa. A minority of less than 8% of the population controls 75% of the agricultural growing lands in Southern Africa. And when we start to think about the outside control of mines, we know that 15 of the top mines are controlled by foreign firms. There's only one in which the state has any control over. So we're talking about our people are impoverished all over Africa. We see young people dying to get out of Africa because they can't use their educations. They are not employed. And we go down to even the levels of people who are right now right here in Kenya, where we're talking about the exorbitant cost of food, the fact that there are many landless people who were taken away or pushed off their lands during the struggle for decolonization. People were pushed into the cities, and that's why we have all these informal settlements. And now these people many of them don't have anywhere to go, and they're in these cities with no jobs, and food soaring in price. So we have to ask ourselves again, what must be done to liberate African people? And I think that African Liberation Day, how is it relevant to this? It's relevant to this is that we have to not only be able to rebel about what we're not getting from our land, rebel about the prices, but we have to find a way where the people actually are empowered and understand their power and are organized in their power. And then we have to look at it in the context of the whole, what are we up against? Because we're not just up against, unfortunately, just the governments and what people like to emphasize, corruption. But of course, corruption is around the world, but other people feed their people. We can concentrate, and we should concentrate to some degree, on our local governments and their lack of response to our needs. But we also have to look at how do foreign corporations control the local economy. They certainly do it by having corrupt partners in these countries. But more importantly, they do it by force. They do it by using their military strength. When World War II ended, they told us that the reason why they needed to form something like NATO was because NATO would help them against the socialist camp, the Soviet Union at the time. They said they needed to come together, and we know NATO is a combination, was founded in the side of the United States. Now, the United States emerged out of World War II as the strongest army and the strongest economy in the world. They were already the military giants because they didn't lose anything like the British lost. Being bombed during Europe was so-called Western Europe was to a certain degree devastated. Certainly the Russians had many losses, millions of people killed in this struggle. But now they told us, and the other side of that, of course, is that they said they needed this to protect against the spread of socialism and the Soviet Union, yet they didn't war with the Soviet Union. They were at war with Germany and Japan and and Italy, right? So now, the logic of why they came together has to be understood, and what they really were saying is that we want to preserve imperialism and colonial relationships with the rest of the world. So we're coming together as a superpower. Not only will we have the U.S., the strongest military already, is building an alliance of former colonial governments, Britain, France, what have you. So this is what is propping up bad governance, not only in Africa, but around the world. They have been known to overthrow in Latin America, in Asia, and be brutal in terms of any time they see a fissure of some people who want to own their own resources, control their own resources, and use them for their people, they become incensed and find a way to get rid of them and kill them and whatever. So the movements are necessary in each place, certainly, for this land, food and freedom, that the theme of ALD here in Kenya this year. It's necessary to understand that to defend the continent, we need the same kind of organization that we had, the kind of unity that we were able to evolve in the fight against traditional colonialism. You know, when we were fighting against colonialism in one country, another country in Africa was aiding them. Like Tanzania was giving bases to the fighters in southern Africa. Guinea Conakry was giving bases to the fighters in Guinea-Bissau. The Mozambique and Angola and were coming together with Guinea-Bissau to form a concept, the idea of bringing all their military forces to coordinate their struggle against Portuguese. Now today, we have to think about how do we coordinate our forces across the continent? How do the workers across the continent fight for a fair wage, a living wage, being able to feed their family? How do the peasants who work on the farms, the farm workers, how do they come across the continent? How do the women come together across the continent and to build on what they started at their first meeting in Dar es Salaam, I think it was, when they came together to brought women from across the continent and formed the Pan-African Women's Organization. These are the things that we have to build on, and to understand that it's us coming together and forming a more continental-wide power.
We've talked about the present state of affairs in Africa today. We've seen how the states, the nation states in Africa today, sadly, serve as appendages, mere appendages to these imperial powers. You mentioned the issue of our security forces and how they're intimately and intricately connected to those of the imperialist organs. So we can see that still a lot has to be done. Foreign corporations are here and they're dominating the economies of Africa today. And therefore we see that indeed it's important for us as Africans to come together speedily, to organize speedily, because a lot still has to be done to complete this process of liberation. And I think that is what is going to be the main topic of discussion, is going to be the focus of this year's commemoration of African Liberation Day. Viewers, this year's commemoration of African Liberation Day will be taking place at the Kenya National Theatre, Ukumbi Mdogo, on the 25th of May, that's on Thursday, from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. The theme for this year's commemoration is Africans Stand Ready for the Revolution, Onward to Land, Food and Freedom. A very powerful theme indeed, comrade, isn't it?
Of course it is. It is. And I think if we unpack it,
yeah,
even the beginning, the whole notion of standing ready for revolution. And many people think standing ready for revolution, and you know, we hear the word revolution, they immediately go to the idea that you know, that you're revolutionary if you are willing to die for the struggle. You know, I think that in reality, all of us are going to die. So that can't be the only prerequisite for being a revolutionary, is to be willing to die. Because whether we're willing or not, we're going to die. That's not the only prerequisite. I think when we say, what does it mean to be ready for the revolution? I think we have to really get across to people that when we say being ready for revolution, that means that they needed to know what they're fighting for and what they're fighting against, which means part of our struggle is to make people politically aware, politically conscious, and we do that through political education. We have to convince people that they have to study their material conditions. They have to study it, and they have to. Certainly, you can learn by experience. People know that the food prices are going up. They don't need to read a volume or a book to know that. But why are they going up? And who's controlling that? And who has power over that? And why are they going up? This requires you to study some. And what can you do about it? That requires you to study what other people done. How did the situation, how did food sovereignty and food production and control of resources happen in places around the world? How did the Soviets get, the Russian revolution happen? How did they get control of their resources and food? How did the Cubans get control of their resources? How did land reclaiming happen in Zimbabwe? All these things must be studied. We must have a study. So part of being ready for revolution is to prepare yourself politically. You have to politically educate yourself. And how do we do that? Through organization. So the second prerequisite of being ready for the revolution is organization, because organization decides everything. So when we have to emphasize that nothing happens by magic. We're not going to strike a rock and food is going to come. We're going to have to organize ourselves to change our conditions. So when you tell me that you're ready for a revolution, and most of the organizations that are putting on African Liberation Day on the 25th are ready for revolution because they're organized. They have a political education process going on in their organizations. They are ready for revolution because they're taking the prerequisite steps. It's not romantic, it's not idealistic, it's real because they're organizing around it. And what we want to get over and to the people who come to African Liberation Day, you can't even say you're ready for revolution, you're not in the organization. You can't say you're ready for a revolution, you're not studying for your people. You know, picking up a gun and shooting a gun doesn't make you a revolutionary. In fact, if you're confused, it might make you a bandit, as
Sankara
says. Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. So I think these are the, that's one part of it. But I think right now in history, the theme, this notion of land, food, and freedom is paramount in us understanding the land question. And the land question being, who controls the land and resources within a society? How are they controlled? Why are we, the masses of the people, not benefiting from the land and resources in the places that they're living? I mean, that was one of the first things that Malcolm X talked about. He said revolutions are fought for land. It's about land. It's about who controls what, because what does land produce? You don't, outside of, if we include water with land, we understand that all food comes from there, right? Yeah, nobody's, nothing's falling out of the sky. The land, how is it being used in our, in the places where we live? Are there more cash crops owned by foreigners? Or do we have control of the land and producing food? And not only producing the food, but whatever processes it takes to make it edible. Are we controlling that? I'm for land conservation. I'm for clean climates and stuff. But who's controlling the conservation? Who is controlling the land, the decisions on land in a country where we should also be thinking about how do we sustain and bring down the cost of everyday food to the everyday person? That's what I'm trying to say. How that is something that is more important for us to understand how we regain what we had before the colonial period. How do we control the day? It doesn't. I'm not saying we're going back in time. We're going forward in time. But we want to organize our resources for the interests of the people. We don't want resources for the interest of foreign corporations. We don't mind sharing. But it's nobody should come in my house and eat up all my food and I have nothing. I invite you to my house to share with me, but you can't come and take all the food off my shelf and my children go hungry. That makes no sense. You can't be the government of the people and you abuse the people. You can only be the government of the people if you organize the people so that they can tell you what they need, what they want, and what they need to survive. Because that's what I think this theme is really giving us. It's giving us a discussion on how we must move forward, and it's giving us a concrete reality of talking about the very basic things for life. Out of all the human rights that we might discuss, the idea of people having the right to food is so paramount.
Yeah, survival, as we've seen, that is exactly what we're going to get when we struggle for our liberation, as we struggle for land, food, and freedom. Viewers, you cannot afford to miss this year's commemoration of African Liberation Day. We look forward to seeing you and everyone else in this year's commemoration. Like we had said before, it's going to be held at the Kenyan National Theatre, Ukumbi Mdogo. It's going to be held on Thursday, 25th May 2023, from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. We look forward to seeing you there. We look forward to continuing this very comprehensive discussion with you on that day. Thank you very much, viewers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me again. And it's great to have the field marshal right here in between us, the original fighter for land freedom. Yeah.
Ila siku ya wiki miezi nenda rudi vile sisi naishi